Welcome back, my fellow seekers. Christmas is upon us, and there has been talk about the Christmas star that is coming. And they're saying this only happens once every 800 years, and that is the alignment between Saturn and Jupiter. But I don't think this is the star of Bethlehem. I believe there is some confusion on what the star of Bethlehem was. Just as with the legend of Atlantis, there may have been two events put together, so too that could have been the case for the Star of Bethlehem. The first event was that of an angel appearing to Mary and Joseph, whether through an apparition, manifestation, or a dream, hard to say. But most likely some kind of manifestation had to happen to the shepherds and the wise men, specifically those that were traveling up from Ethiopia and Persia, and something had to guide them to the exact location of Christ's birth. So that had to be an angel that had to guide them. But at the same time, there may have been a prophetic sign in the sky, and that would not have been Jupiter or Saturn, but Venus, the morning star, the brightest star in the night sky. And this was even brighter than in alignment with Saturn and Jupiter, because Saturn would have been covered up pretty much mostly by Jupiter, so the luminosity isn't that much different compared to Venus, which is a lot brighter in the morning. So I believe the morning star, the star of Lucifer, star of Ishtar, or Inanna, whatever you want to call it, was that prophetic sign that the wise men were using as a reassurance on, should we cross this desert to see some random baby? Did it fit the prophecy? So an angel plus the sign in the sky is what led to the idea of the Star of Bethlehem. And another thing that might make this the Christ star is, what if God had manifested his spirit on Venus 1 billion years ago? And so this is the theological question we need to ask ourselves. Did God appear on Venus? Or maybe the better question is, would God appear on other planets?
The question of are we alone in the universe may not be the proper question, but the better question might be, when were we not alone in the universe? Time is the great filter of the Fermi paradox, but God is outside of time and space, so it's not a limiting factor for high-level supernatural creatures like God or archangels. The question of had God manifested in another avatar body to spark civilization starts to make it sound like maybe we're not important to God if he's done it on many planets. And what does that mean for the title of Mary as the Queen of Heaven and the second coming of Christ? Does this change anything? If we find evidence of a civilization with a similar religion, it would mean that God has put everything in a humbling position. No one planetary civilization is favored over another. We have to remember, God doesn't need us, but we need God to evolve to a higher evolutionary state. The civilization that best connects with the force of God will evolve to a higher state, but that depends on the choices of that civilization. And supernatural interventions may be the spark that kickstarts civilizations on many planets, but God leaves it mostly up to us to pass the great filters within the laws that he has programmed. I bring this topic up because some of you might have heard of the news about Venus. Although the surface is hellish, around 30 miles up in the atmosphere, the temperature and pressure is on average of that of Earth's surface. Back in September 2020, the signature of phosphine was detected, although faint, but two observatories have confirmed this. Phosphine can be the byproduct of bacterial or chemical and geological processes on the surface. But what they noticed was that phosphine was being produced at a faster rate than it was being destroyed. It was noticed by a team of researchers led by Professor Jane Grievous from the UK. So this was a biosignature from a common byproduct of living metabolism from extremophile microbes. But phosphine has been detected by abiotic processes on Jupiter and Saturn, but it's not known if these processes also are happening on Venus due to the high pressures. And any leakage would be simply just trapped by the dense atmosphere and it would die out and be destroyed. But it's also possible this is simply the signature of lightning, but again, lightning is not known to produce high quantities of phosphine. If these are microbes, then they would be living in a blend of sulfuric acid mixed with water droplets through releasing spores and recycling its life cycle within the upper atmosphere. These microbes would be the generational remnants of Venus's more stable past. So now two things have been detected on Venus, the signature of granite and now phosphine, as well as volcanism that is still active in some areas, indicating that the outgassing that Venus experienced was less than 700 million years ago. But before that, it's not known how the whole surface of Venus resorted to massive volcanism in such a short period of time. One hypothesis is Venus had a moon hundreds of millions of years before the resurfacing event. The moon may have collapsed onto Venus in many pieces over time, sparking the resurfacing event of Venus. Or Venus had lost its moon, and that moon today may be Mercury, that got pulled by the sun as the sun expanded and pushed the habitable zone farther away. So let's say something like this did happen that led to the greenhouse effect and created a stagnant lid state on Venus's surface, halting the tectonic forces. But between 1 billion and 2 billion years ago, Venus was clearly in the habitable zone, whereas Mars was not. And it may have had a moon and was spinning normally with a magnetic field. So Venus would have had every opportunity to evolve a Type 1 civilization. Only 500 million years is all Venus would need to create complex life. So then, would God need to come to this planet to spark a Type 1 civilization if the evolutionary process was stagnating? There is a misconception that the Watchers, the angels, are just watching. But if you've seen my videos, you'll know that they're doing more than just watching. So God would have to keep the angels in check for his overall agenda. Now, before we can get into the theological implications, we need to address how we might even know if Venus had a Type 1, let alone a Type 2 civilization. Again, a Type 1 is simply a planetary civilization, and Type 2 is a solar civilization, but due to the Fermi paradox, there's far more Type 1s than there are Type 2. But a Type 1 would leave some evidence of its existence. Not on Venus, but on its moon, and even on our moon, where the erosion rate from meteorites would be less than that on planet Earth or Venus. So yes, we need to find a monolith, but not a hunk of scrap in the Arizona desert, but surviving satellites and probes like the ones we've sent to Mars. The Venetians would have targeted Mercury, Earth, and our moon with lander probes a billion years ago. The ones that would survive without totally being covered over by regolith would be the larger rovers, something like the size of a truck, if they had reached past Type 1.1. We are currently at about Type 0.8. So since we are below a Type 1, it's going to take centuries for us to discover their monoliths somewhere in the solar system. Due to the laws of physics and evolution, their anatomy would actually be very similar to us, evolving in the image and likeness of God, as I explained in my video on Venus in relation to Alita. Now, more than likely the Venetians did explore Earth, but Earth a billion years ago was not really habitable, although more habitable than Mars is today. Mars would have been outside of that zone, whereas Earth would have been more in the center back of the habitable zone. Venus may have been more in the center front, where Earth sits today. But Earth back then was drier and colder, but it did have one big ocean. But the ocean was very sterile, with only cyanobacteria life slowly pumping oxygen in. At the time, Earth only had about 2% or less, compared to today's 21%. Also, carbon dioxide was a lot higher, maybe at least 25%, due to the higher volcanism. And Earth's spin was faster each day. Sunrise and sunset was 18 hours or shorter. The moon was still trying to slow down Earth's rotation, stabilizing the supercontinent Rodinia. So any chance of finding a Venetian monolith or artifact is very slim. Now, Venus's closest approach to Earth was about 24 million miles, whereas Mercury is about 31 million miles. But this may have been a difference of margin of error of about 10 million miles. We just don't know the rates of expansion. But due to Earth looking larger, you would think that the Venetians would have targeted Earth, but Mercury may have been closer at one time and would have been physically easier to land a probe. And if they wanted to leave evidence of their existence, choosing Mercury may better increase the likelihood of a monolith surviving, but it may be more likely that an ancient dead satellite set in a solar orbit would survive even longer. Now, there has been some unusual monoliths found on Mars and Phobos, but these tend to look like boulders sticking out of the regolith. For example, the Phobos monolith, if you look closely, there are actually 3 objects sticking out of the regolith compared to the surrounding area, but we will need even more high-definition photos to see the details. More than likely, it's just an inner core rock boulder jutting out of the impact area where the regolith has been dispersed. Or it could be a very slow asteroid that softly landed onto Phobos. But it's very unusual, and NASA should send another probe for closer examination. For now, let's just assume this is evidence of the Venetians sending a large lander probe that was abandoned a billion years ago. So would God appear to ancient species on other planets? Would they have a soul? Well, if you see my Alita video, I would argue yes, aliens would have a soul and even synthetic biological cyborgs. If it possesses the image and likeness of God, evolution tends to lead to an optimal form that now allows God to place a soul and not just a spirit that simply reincarnates over and over or simply ceases to exist until God opens the dimension of heaven. And that gate may open when that species evolves to an optimal form and becomes self-aware of the existence of supernatural forces. For us humans, that happened around 70,000 years ago when art and religion was born. This is the same process that would occur on other planets like Venus if God desires intelligent life, and I would think He does. And the Church is open to this logic so long as it doesn't contradict the claims of the historical manifestations of God on Earth.
Welcome back to The World Over. In May, Pope Francis set tongues a-wagging when in a homily during his morning mass, he referenced a visit from extraterrestrials. The media ran with it and suggested that the Catholic Church was confirming the existence of intelligent life on other planets. Joining us tonight is a man who has literally pondered the mysteries of the heavens as part of his job. He is an astronomer at the Vatican Observatory and the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation, a Jesuit, and the co-author of the new book, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? We're delighted to have joining us Brother Guy Consolmagno in studio. Great to see you, brother.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Pope Francis, during one of his morning homilies, had this to say. I'll share it with the audience. He said, imagine if, for example, tomorrow, an expedition of Martians came, green with long noses and big ears, just like children draw them, and were to say, I want to be baptized. What would happen? Here's the big question. Yeah. Would you baptize an extraterrestrial?
Only if she asks.
Okay.
Is that right now some of the Opus Dei level theologians at the Pontifical Academy in Rome, as well as the Pope's University in Rome, are working on doctrine that very specifically has to do with religious information of an extraterrestrial source and what the impact of that might be on faith on Earth. For instance, Father Giuseppe Tanzellaniti is an Opus Dei level theologian. He works at the Pontifical University, the Pope's University in Rome. And here's what he says. He says that if extraterrestrial intelligence provides information, it may cause us to have to rethink everything we have ever known and believed about the gospel. Here's a quote. He says, it would not immediately oblige the Christian to renounce his own faith in God simply on the basis of the reception of new, unexpected information of a religious character from extraterrestrial civilizations, but that such a renunciation could come soon after as the new religious content originating from outside the earth is confirmed as reasonable and credible. Let me insert here, I have no idea how you would be able to confirm extraterrestrial information that's going to alter the gospel would be reasonable and acceptable, incredible. I don't know what that process is, but let me keep going. Quote, once the trustworthiness of the information has been verified, the believer would have to reconcile such new information with the truth that he or she already knows and believes on the basis of the revelation of the one and triune God, conducting a rereading of the gospel inclusive of the new data. Well, maybe these guys are talking about this because of something that another Roman Catholic priest had talked about, Monsignor Corrado Balducci.
Corrado Balducci was an exorcist and theologian of the Vatican Curia and the foremost demonologist of the Church. During the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, ironically, Balducci also became the official spokesperson on the subject of UFOs and aliens.
Well, that's because the evidence provided by the Pentagon this year in 2020 is starting to shift to a more supernatural explanation and not a biological extraterrestrials of the UFO phenomenon, hence why they changed it to UAP. Taking the word object is a big hint. Even Neil deGrasse Tyson is kind of on board with this in the sense that it doesn't mean aliens. It could be something else. That something else is a little more mysterious. And more evidence will have to be provided by the state, sadly enough. And no doubt the Vatican gets its intel from the CIA. If the intel is pointing to that, then yes, the church has a responsibility to figure out the philosophical and theological implications of this, which really doesn't change church doctrine, but instead reinforces the church's claims on the nature of the supernatural. Now, many biblical literates are trying to demonize the church as like the church is preparing for alien overlords or something. But yes, the church has to prepare for alien encounters on how this might affect church doctrine. You can't just stick your head in the sand. But the current UFO phenomenon is not pointing to ETs, sadly enough. The logic and the evidence just doesn't fit as you've seen with my other videos. Again, when aliens come, it's not going to be subtle or discreet, like the current UAP phenomenon's behavior. It will be very obvious, and that's why the military has to figure out what to do when they do come. Most likely, if you can't beat them, join them. And the church will have to make a decision on this. So yes, they have to ponder the philosophical and theological implications as well as the geopolitical religious implications. Most likely, if there are too many contradictions with this alien race, then the church will have to rebel against them, and just as they did with Nazism and communism. But that may not be necessary. We just don't know until they come. But the chance of a Type 2 or Type 3 civilization is becoming more and more unlikely. Over 4,000 exoplanets have been found, but 99% are very hellish. There are just too many obstacles in the way, which could be God's intention in the first place. Venus may be proof of that, which is why we need to study that planet more closely and look for the evidence of their artifacts. So we are just a spark in God's eye. So before Venus died, Jesus, whatever they may have called him, may have appeared a second time on that planet, marking the end of that civilization. Many believe when Jesus comes, it's going to be a paradise on earth. No, when Jesus comes, it's going to be kind of hellish. It's not going to be a good time. There's going to be a major judgment. I do believe in that something catastrophic will happen, but God may not come right away if we evolve technologically and spiritually in the right direction. God may wait 10,000 years to see how we progress, but there may come to a point, just like in Star Wars, just scaled down, where the Republic world government has become tyrannical and the Antichrist does finally emerge. So God is probably aware that this may be a common phenomenon on many planets, so he has to come and save us permanently from the dark side of the Force coming from demonic angels, to prevent us from becoming some hive mind intelligent civilization or intersolar, probably not galactic, but intersolar civilization, and messing around with other planets, preventing them from evolving in the right direction. So the second coming is not going to be a pretty day. And I think we can narrow down the second coming between the transition between Type 1 and Type 2. So the second coming of Christ on Earth may happen not until like 10,000 years in the future. And that may be when the Antichrist finally emerges, when we're kind of colonizing parts of the solar system, but and unifying Earth as one planetary globalized civilization. So when the Antichrist appears, that's when the veil starts to lift between church and state, where the state starts to tap into the force powers of angels for geopolitical advantages, kind of like what we see in Star Wars, where magic and technology start to converge. The release of the video evidence by the Pentagon this year of the so-called UFO, which is now called UAP, is just one sign of that convergence between the lifting of the veil, between the natural and the supernatural, and that's when politics can get really messy. We saw a tiny inkling of that in Nazi Germany when they were messing around with occultism. Earth is like the bride for Christ. We have to prepare ourselves, but in doing so, we may need saving again. Technology is the catalyst of unveiling the supernatural. as we see with the basic idea of video cameras, revealing personal evidence of an experience. So that's when things get dangerous. Life is merely a test to enter into a higher realm of the force that is God, but there may come a person who possesses supernatural forces and uses that to gain more power against God. This Antichrist is not going to be a normal human, or what you evangelicals like to believe that the Pope is going to become the Antichrist. Yeah, I think this person is going to be far more mysterious than some old man who could barely walk. It could be an alien, that's possible, but doesn't mean that that whole alien race is evil. Just that person, like we see in Star Wars. Not everyone is evil in the Empire, but simply misled and trapped in a system. So Venus may have been the first Garden of Eden of our solar system. The garden is the planet and Eden is outer space. Venus may have already gone through its biblical revelations and reached its end. The convergence with the dark side and light side of the supernatural forces will require God's assistance again to save us. But he is not coming necessarily to save the planet. The planet is simply a tool to get souls into heaven. So this time the planet may end up trapped in a greenhouse effect, just like we see in Venus. And in time, the Earth will die as the sun expands. And the cycle of life may spark once again on Mars, but hundreds of millions of years into the future. And God will be there to harvest his flock once again. So this Christmas, instead of looking at Jupiter and Saturn, take the time to look at Venus as the first Garden of Eden. This has been Enigma Seeker. Have a Merry Christmas, and keep seeking those enigmas.